Welcome to the Thornton Review.
The show designed with you in mind. If it's important to you, it's important to us.
When did the Democrat and Republican parties begin? After the 1824 presidential election, the Democratic Republicans fractured between supporters of Adams and supporters of Andrew Jackson. Jackson's followers formed the Democratic Party, while those who supported Adams formed the National Republican Party. On today's show, we're going to meet retired Lieutenant Commander John Roberts. John is currently the chairman of the Escambia County Republican Party. John has spent numerous years after retirement in the classroom teaching history, among other subjects. John has been on the show before, so we're going to recap some of the history we spoke about on the previous shows. But first, we're going to take a commercial break, and when we come back, we'll begin our discussion with John and learn a little more about the history of the Republican Party. There is no government-funded program that can guide a man's thoughts. Only God can do that. Retired Lieutenant Commander John Roberts grew up in a small town in Illinois. He graduated with his bachelor's degree in social science from Eastern Illinois University in 1973. John entered the Navy Aviation Officer Candidate School in 1977 and got his master's degree in military science from the Army Command and General Staff College in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. John retired as Lieutenant Commander in 1994 and has taught a variety of subjects in middle school and high school, including history, government, and economics. Although John isn't considered to be a professional historian, his knowledge of history might qualify him. John stays active in the community, advocating for conservative policy. As a lifelong conservative Republican, John has been president of Teenage Republicans, College Republicans, and Young Republican clubs. As a member of the Escambia County Republican Executive Committee since 1997, John has served as parliamentarian, vice chairman, and is currently the chairman. John and his wife Wanda have been married 43 years and have 5 children and 16 grandchildren. John, welcome to the show. It's nice to have you back. You've been on the show before, and I always loved the history lesson. I'd like to start off with the recapping of the history of the Republican Party regarding constitutional rights. Can you tell us about the founding of the Republican Party and the Kansas-Nebraska Act?
Yes. Okay, in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, slavery became the most prominent political issue in the United States, and it tended to get more intense with time. In 1854, they proposed the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The Kansas-Nebraska Act would have given the territories of Kansas and Nebraska an opportunity to vote on whether or not they wanted slavery. This would have violated the Missouri Compromise that had been agreed to many years earlier. In the Missouri Compromise, only those areas that were south of the southern border of Missouri would be slave states, and all the other states that were north of that southern border of Missouri would be free states. And so this meant, if you look at a map of the Louisiana Purchase, a lot more territory was north of that line than south, so it meant that there would be more free states than slave states. Up until that time, the number of slave states and free states were about even. In fact, it almost seemed we put a new free state in when we put a new slave state in to keep that number even, which meant that in the Senate, at least, there were going to be an equal number of pro-slave and pro-free senators. Well, with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, that upset that. So now these states could potentially become slave states instead of requiring them to be free states. So that caused a lot of consternation. A lot of people opposed that. Many people in the Democrat Party opposed it. Many people in the Whig Party opposed it. And there was a small party called the Free Soilers that also opposed that. So a few of them, just a handful, got together in a small town of Ripon, Wisconsin, and they decided, we've got to start a new party. We've got to start a party that unites the pro-free, the anti-slavery people in America, and have a party that's composed just of those people, and put the pro-slavery people in another party. And that's exactly what happened. So they started they met in a church in Ripon, Wisconsin, and they started a new party, and they called themselves Republicans. Okay? And very quickly that spread. We found people in the Whigs who were pro-slavery became Democrats. People in the Whigs who were pro-free became Republicans. And others started to split themselves, independents started to split themselves along those lines. So we had a Republican Party, which would be anti-slavery, against the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And we had the Democrat Party, which became almost exclusively people who were, in one degree or another, in favor of slavery, or at least in favor of allowing slavery to exist in other states, even if they didn't own slaves themselves. And that's really how the two parties came about. And it was over that issue.
That's interesting to know. I'll bet a lot of people don't realize that.
Yeah, that is the origins. Yeah, and I think the principles that caused the founding are still present today. That to favor civil rights, to favor which simply is constitutional rights for citizens. Citizens' constitutional rights. That's what civil rights really means. That is still a guiding principle of the Republican Party, and it's still a weak spot on the Democrat side. They've always had a very weak commitment to that, and a very weak commitment to the Constitution. Once the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were adopted, Republicans were enthusiastic about supporting them. The Democrats were trying ways to get around them, to stop implementing those principles. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. Okay, the 14th Amendment gave all former slaves their citizenship rights. And the 15th Amendment gave all former slaves the right to vote. Okay, again, in many cases only men could vote then, but all the ones who, if you were black or if you were a former slave, you were given the right to vote by the 15th Amendment. Every single Democrat, North and South, in the House and the Senate, voted against the 15th Amendment. It was passed exclusively with Republican votes. And we saw after it was adopted, states controlled by the Democrats were trying to find a way around it. They kept trying to pass laws with literacy tests, with poll taxes, or with other laws, the Grandfather Acts. If your grandfather could vote, you could vote, but if your grandfather couldn't, you couldn't. All kinds of means to prevent
that doesn't make any sense.
Former slaves from voting. I might add that only 5% of the black people in America at the time of the Civil War were already free. Okay, yeah. So they were already free, and they were living in the North. Okay, so this gave the other 95% of blacks who were in slavery their freedom, and of course then their right to vote. But it didn't always work out that way, unfortunately, because Democrat states were blocking it. They simply found ways to keep black people from voting. And we saw that for 100 years. Constant attempts to do that.
Interesting. So let's skip around a little bit. Can you tell us about the religious influence and what was going on during the French Revolution in 1789?
Okay, this is really important because I was talking with another teacher once, and we were talking about religion and history and its impact and whatnot. And she made the comment, well, we should not allow anything that's religious in nature to be part of the public life. Okay, it shouldn't be taught in school, shouldn't be used. We just shouldn't have any of that. And I asked this lady, how many days are in a week?
7.
And she stumbled. Well, of course there's 7. But then I said, why? And she really struggled with that. And
I know, if you think about it, let the audience think about that for a minute. Why are there 7 days in a week?
It's purely religious. It comes from the first chapter of the Bible in the book of Genesis. Okay, something accepted by Jewish people and Christian people. that God created in 6 days and rested on the seventh. And so that created the 7-day week at that point. Other cultures that were Buddhist or Confucian, Hindu, didn't have that 7-day week. It came from Judeo-Christian influence. And as that spread, we now see it pretty much worldwide. But it wasn't always that way. But the 7-day week is simply an example of something that's purely religious in nature that we use every day, all the time.
Right, yeah.
Okay?
I mean, our lives revolve around the week.
And the year. I say, what year is it? Well, this is 2024. And I said, why?
Right.
Okay.
That's
There's
another
no
good
natural
question.
phenomenon that we can point to. I said it goes back to the Christian
Christ.
era. Okay, the presumed year of Christ's birth was year 1. They may have miscalculated it by 3 or 4 years, but still it was an attempt to revolve our calendar around the birth of Christ, at least an approximation. So we celebrate that today, and we use that calendar today. If we really want to get rid of all religious influence, we'd have to
You'd have to get away with the calendar.
We'd have to get away
and the
with
days
the week.
of the week. Yeah, and
The
the year.
The French Revolution in 1789 was an anti-religious revolution. It was a liberal, a left-wing revolution. Why do we call it left-wing? Because in the French Parliament, the people who supported the French Revolution sat to the left of the speaker.
Ah, okay.
The supporters. The ones who were against the French Revolution sat to the right. So it was people who were for the French Revolution on the left, people who were against it sitting on the right. And that's where our terms for right and left come today.
Okay.
Now on the left side, the people who supported the revolution were against anything that was godly, anything having to do with religion or church. They want to eliminate that influence from their society. And they went so far as to do away with the 7-day week. They actually abolished
That
it.
didn't last long.
It lasted 2.5 years. They created a 10-day week.
Wow.
Okay, so in France for 2.5 years.
So you'd have to change the month, the entire calendar of the months.
Yes. It just,
But the Earth still revolves around the sun on a certain number of days.
Yeah.
So you still have the
They
year.
changed that because that was
You
a
can't
natural
change the
base.
year, yeah.
But they changed the week, and people hated it. It
Yeah.
was very unpopular. But they were so committed to doing away with religious influence in their
Wow.
society that they got rid of the 7-day week because they obviously recognized that is purely
Right.
religious in its origin. That's Jewish and Christian. That's
It's
not
purely biblical.
Yes, it is purely
And-
biblical.
And that's what the entire world revolves around
Yes.
now is the
We all-
biblical 7-day week.
Yeah, it's a 7-day week and a
That's
year
wild.
based on the birth of
That's
Christ.
amazing.
Now, some Muslim countries try to use a different calendar. They try to use in the 600s, as the Muslim religion was being formed, they started their calendar there. And some of them still use that. But even they realize they're going against the grain of the rest of the world. And so they kind of have to be aware of what the year is in the Western countries and the rest of the world, even though they try to practice a different year in their countries. But it doesn't work very well. In any case, the world is based on a calendar that is biblical. Okay? And that's what so we're really not getting rid. It's very unpopular to try to get rid of all religious influence in our society.
Right.
Not only in terms of the calendar, but in terms of other principles that we have as well.
They've tried to get rid of prayer in school and the 10 Commandments at the courthouses.
They want to do with all religious influence, and they try to argue that we must get rid of this religious influence because that shows discrimination against people who might not be religious.
Well, they want complete separation of church and state, but that's impossible.
Well-
You can try, even if you call it that, you're never going to have complete separation. There's just too much influence.
You can get rid of the structure of the government controlling the church or the church controlling the government. But what we do not want is a separation of moral principles
Right.
that come from Judeo-Christian thought from public policy. It's perfectly right and reasonable to have our government based on principles of Judeo-Christian values. And that's really what Western civilization is built on.
Yeah.
We're built on those values. And that is what makes us who we are. And because we followed those, we've had success in many areas. And trying to remove those is and replace it with a very secular, humanistic point of view is what the left is all about.
They've
Just
tried
like
to
they
do
were-
it numerous times, and it doesn't last long. We keep going back. So I'd like to talk about the definition of the separation of church and state. And I'd like to tell you what my idea of that is. My idea of the separation of church and state is that the state isn't going to tell you you have to be Catholic or you have to be Protestant. And it's not going to tell you what church you have to go to or what religion, who you want to worship.
Yes.
The state, the government is not going to tell you how to worship.
Right.
That's why this entire country was formed, because when the Pilgrims came over, they came over for religious freedom, and they are the first people to come from Europe to colonize America.
Right.
They came for religious freedom.
First, but they were very early.
We can go into that. But the church cannot punish you for your crimes. That's the other separation.
Right.
If the church knows that you committed a crime, if you go to the pastor and confess a tragic crime, it's not up to the pastor to punish you.
Put you in jail. No.
But it would be up to the pastor to say, we need to talk about this and we need to take a walk down to the police station. You need to turn yourself in, type of thing.
Yes.
That's the separation of church and state. So that's my definition. Can we hear your definition?
Yes. Well, the separation of church and state is not actually in the Constitution, not in the Bill of Rights.
Okay.
They worded the First Amendment very carefully. Congress shall not establish a religion. It shall make no law that establishes regarding the establishment of religion. Mm-hmm. It doesn't say we won't create an established church. It says we will make no law regarding an established religion. Mm-hmm. Why did they choose that wording? Because many of the states had established churches.
Oh, and the state constitutions tell citizens that they need to be members of a church.
They can.
The Florida Constitution
not necessarily
does.
tell them to members. It varies state to state.
My wording is always a little different.
But it acknowledges that there is a recognized state church.
Yes.
For instance, in Connecticut, they had the Congregational Church was the official state church. Mm-hmm. Now, if you were a Baptist living in Connecticut, you could still be a Baptist. Okay, they didn't say you couldn't practice your faith, but the Congregational Church was recognized and supported by the state as the official state church. Mm-hmm. You went to other states, the Episcopal Church might have been the recognized church.
Right.
So it did vary. But even after we adopted the First Amendment, even after we adopted all the Bill of Rights, including the First Amendment, which said that Congress shall not make any law regarding an establishment of religion, is that
the basic premise of separation of church and state?
That's where it derives from, okay? Uh-huh. But it's really not a separation of church and state.
Right.
It just says the Congress shall not establish one. There were 3 states, Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Hampshire, who still had a state church after the First Amendment was adopted. Mm-hmm. And those were completely constitutional.
Sure.
Because Congress
it's not
couldn't interfere.
Federal.
If a state wanted to have a state church, they could. Mm-hmm. If they didn't want to, they could. Mm-hmm. Congress would not make any law affecting the establishment of a religion in a state, whether they had one or didn't have one.
They gave the states the
Most
authority.
of the other states disestablished their state church that had one. Most of them disestablished that. Mm-hmm. But there were 3 that kept them. Connecticut, New Hampshire kept until 1819. Mm-hmm. Massachusetts, ironically, kept theirs till 1833. They were the last state to finally separate their church from the Massachusetts government. Mm-hmm. And no state has yet, since then, established a church. So we do have a separation of church and state now, as far as their organizations, in every state since 1833, and I don't know anybody who's trying to change that and make a church the established church of a state. Right. I don't know anybody who's really advocating that now.
Yeah.
So we have separation of church and state, but not of moral principles from public policy.
Right.
I have a question.
Yes.
When I grew up, I think I started school in 1958. I'm telling how old I am. But in 1958, up until, as far as I can remember, in elementary and middle school, we used to pray in school. We used to not wake up, but we would come to school and we would say the prayer and we would pledge allegiance to the flag. Exactly, do you know much about when did that happened? Did someone file a lawsuit?
1962. There were actually various events that happened before that, but the key one was 1962. Madeline Murray O'Hare had a son in the school system in New York, and New York had an established prayer that was acceptable to most people that children would say every day. Well, this woman objected to it because she was an atheist and she did not want her son saying that prayer. Well, they said he didn't have to say it. But then if he didn't say it, she felt that made him stand out among the other students. Yeah. That marked him in some way. So she felt like nobody should be doing it. Okay? And she didn't want her son to be in a classroom where everybody else was doing it and he wasn't. Or he had to leave the room or anything of that nature. So she went to Supreme Court to say that prayer was a violation of the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. Now again, the First Amendment was not designed to even tell a state they couldn't have a state church, much less that there couldn't be a prayer or Bible reading or something of that nature going on in the school district.
Anywhere, yeah.
But nonetheless, we had a fairly liberal Supreme Court, and they did rule that they could no longer do that. And the basis of that decision caused several other decisions subsequent to that, which tended to eliminate any religious practice on public property. Okay, and the Supreme Court's had to battle that over the years because as more conservatives got on the court, they were trying to change it to what they felt the Constitution really meant, and not to have this bias that there can be no religious practice on public property. Right. It even went so extreme that Boy Scout groups who said you had to believe in God were not allowed to use public parks, have camps or any other activities. They couldn't sponsor an activity there.
Wow.
They couldn't meet after school in public property. Now, courts eventually changed that ruling and allowed that to happen. That if schools are going to open their facilities to outside groups, they cannot exclude a group because they have a religious viewpoint. They had to allow that. But it's been a constant battle in the courts ever since then, as liberals constantly try to eliminate any religious practice in public places, and conservatives want freedom. They say, no, you have to allow people of faith to be able to use public facilities for a purpose that they want to do. We cannot take away their freedom on that. So that's been a very major issue for a long time.
I remember the old saying when I was coming up after they stopped that, they say, as long as there are tests and exams in school, there's going to be prayer.
Right, yeah. Lots of prayer before the test, yeah.
Even if it's a silent prayer, it's kind of hard to get rid of it that way. But that's pretty interesting in 1972 because I started...
62.
62, I mean 62 because I started in 58.
Yeah.
And I remember at that particular first few years of elementary school,
we never prayed in school. When I was growing up, we said the Pledge of Allegiance every day, but some of my elementary teachers did have Bible verses on the wall. And it was, even though it was public school, where I went to school was very Christian. Everybody went to church. I want to get into we're going to take a commercial break first, but I would like to get into the definition of conservatism.
Okay.
So we're going to take a commercial break, and when we come back, we'll continue our discussion with John Roberts, and he's going to give us the definition of conservatism. There is no government-funded program that can guide a man's thoughts. Only God can do that. So, John, a lot of people don't know, well, I don't know if a lot of people know or not, the definition of conservatism. What are we conserving?
That's exactly the question. Conservatives obviously want to conserve something, but what is it? Is it the status quo? No. That's what gets taught a lot of times. No, conservatives do not necessarily want to preserve the status quo. The status quo in China is communism. Conservatives do not want to preserve
The status quo,
as its status quo
Yeah.
in China. No, what we want to preserve is Western civilization, and particularly the Judeo-Christian
And
principles
families.
that undergird Western civilization, or at least have for the past few centuries.
Yep.
That is what we want to preserve. Unless we can preserve those Judeo-Christian principles as the foundation of our society and our government, then we've lost really what the purpose of this country is all about. Because we said in our declaration, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Okay, so we do not have rights because the government gives us rights. We have rights because we are human beings. Our Creator God, has given us rights. Doesn't matter whether you're an atheist or religious or whatever, you have rights because your Creator, according to the Declaration of Independence, your Creator has given you those rights.
And the Bible tells us exactly how to live and what those rights are.
And the Declaration of Independence goes on and says, governments are instituted to secure these rights. So that's the American purpose of government. We have a government to secure the rights that our Creator has given us. Not rights that government gives us, but rights that come from our Creator. We are human beings. We all have dignity. We have rights to life. We should have freedom. We should be able to support our family. We should be able to live our lives as we wish, as long as we are not harming others.
And we're responsible, though.
And we are responsible.
We're responsible with those rights. We don't abuse those rights.
Yes, exactly. And that's really what conservatism is all about. Now, if I go a little deeper, so what are the foundations of Judeo-Christian views that undergird us? What are some of them specifically? Well, one is that we are a spiritual being. Humans are a spiritual being. We're a material being, yes, but we're also a spiritual being, and we consider the spiritual more important. So government's purpose is spiritual, and that it's to preserve our freedom. Let us practice our faith, support our families. Okay? Those are the essence of the spiritual values. Yes, there are material values, and yes, those are important too. But the left focuses on the material. They believe government has a responsibility to provide material things to people.
No.
And to do away, and they ignore the whole spiritual side of freedom, faith, and family. They want to just provide the material resources for people. And the problem is government can't provide material resources
They want people
for people
to rely on the government.
Yes.
I know that, and I've learned this at an early age. This country was founded, the Constitution and everything was founded on biblical principle, and it kind of irks me. I'm not sure that's a word or not, but I kind of get disappointed when I see folks try to take away that basic foundation.
Yes.
Most of our laws come from biblical principle. I remember listening to when Martin Luther King was out there doing the civil rights movement. He said a law that does not match up to the law of the Bible pretty much is not if it's not a moral law, and when you say moral, he was referencing the biblical, then it's really not a law at all.
It's not a legitimate law. It's an abuse of power.
It's not a legitimate law at all. But yet we still have some of the progressive and the Democrats try to change the law to fit the law. And there are a lot of things
To fit their narrative,
to fit a certain narrative. And I think that's another thing that conservatism is that try to get back to the basic founding of the country, that there were some flaws in there, some faults in there. Just because you correct the flaw does not mean that you create a lot of more flaws. That we have made course corrections in a lot of areas, but at the same time, we've gotten off track
Yes.
in a lot of areas. So we get back to that basic principle of conservatism.
Yes. And a second factor, I might say, outside the fact that man is spiritual as well as material, and the spiritual is more important, a second factor of Judeo-Christian thought is that man is imperfect. We are by nature imperfect. We are, the Bible would say, sinful.
Yes.
Okay? None of us is perfect. We're all flawed, and none of us can claim perfection in all that we do and all that we say. Okay? And we can't make ourselves perfect. Only God can do that. We are people who are inherently imperfect and flawed, so therefore no one person should have too much power, political power. So what do? We separate political power. Okay, our Constitution does a brilliant job of this. We created a executive branch, a legislative branch, and a judicial branch. Each one has checks over the other. Okay? Now, if we had perfect people around that we could just elect to be head of the government, well, we could just elect that person to be the head. They would be a dictator in charge of everything.
Yeah.
That doesn't ever work. Why doesn't that work? Because the person
they're
isn't
imperfect.
Perfect. They're imperfect by nature.
So
we're going to make mistakes. So we need to divide political power not only among three branches, but in the United States between the national or federal level and the local level. So that's a further division of powers. And on top of that, we limit the power of government. Okay? So the Constitution has a lot of limitations on what anybody can do with government. So all those things factor in the fundamental principle: man is a sinful being, he is imperfect, and we do not want too much power to rest in a single individual.
Or a group of people.
A group, yes. So
because of their
that
imperfections.
division and limits of power is critical. That's a biblical principle.
The checks and balances is critical.
Yes, all that is part of that same foundation, and that's why that's what conservatives believe. So we want to preserve a system which recognizes government has limitations. Okay, we want the spiritual to be more important than material. And by the way, government can't do the material. Government is never a source of goods. Anything the government gives to the people, it has to first take from the people. So government's impossible for them to be a source of goods. So government can't provide. It can take from one and give to another, but when it does that, it tends to... Then we see things happening as a result of political power, not because of need.
And taxes, abuse of taxes.
Taxes and regulations and so forth. So that's critical to forming the foundation of conservatism, and that's really what Republicans believe. You know, I had the political science professors in college. They were all Democrats. I didn't agree with them on anything, but there was one thing we did agree on. Okay? There was one thing, and that was the Republican Party was more conservative, and the Democrat Party was more liberal. We did agree on that.
Yeah.
Well, when we look at the three branches, we've gotten to a point where certain politicians, and that's what I would call them, within the branches, the separate branches, if a certain branch does not rule or vote their way, they try to overrule and overpower that branch. But each one has their own distinct function, and there are certain ways, if you don't agree with it, to do away with it. I look at certain things that happen, even to the point of day before yesterday, when the Supreme Court remanded back to the state of Texas, saying, okay, you can do certain things with illegal immigrants. You can, and I heard the president say that I'm going to have to. It's unconstitutional. He called a Supreme Court law. He said it was unconstitutional, mainly because it did not fit with his particular way of thinking and a certain way of thinking with his base. And what these branches does, and anything that's not founded in the Constitution, and that each individual branch does not collectively agree upon, particularly within the legislative branch, then those powers and those rights and those functions are sent back to the state under the conservative way of thinking, and the way the country was built. We've even gotten away from that, where we have now all-powerful federal government that has taken on some of the responsibilities of the state government, And I just wanted to make that as an observation. It may not be in line with what you were saying, but I just wanted to make that as a resident.
We are a constitutional republic, not a pure direct democracy. And the constitutional republic abides by the Constitution. And it's been a major difference between the Republican and Democrat parties. The Democrat Party, going back to Woodrow Wilson even, okay, can you go back to those who refused to accept the 14th and 15th Amendments and constantly tried to reverse them or prevent them from being enforced, and that was all from the Democrat Party. And then Woodrow Wilson said, and he was very clear about this, that he was an advocate of liberal adjustments, I quote, to the Constitution from time to time. He said the Constitution is putting a straitjacket on us. It's inhibiting us from doing things
from
that,
sinning.
Quote, they want to do.
Yeah.
Well, that's the design of the Constitution is to put a bit of a restraint on the federal government, to limit what they can do.
Right.
And it's totally wrong to suggest otherwise, but that's the essence of the Democrat Party. Wilson said it. Roosevelt was so upset because he tried to do so many things that were not constitutional, and the Supreme Court kept telling him, no, you can't do that. That's not allowed in the Constitution. What was his solution? Well, let's increase the number of Supreme Court justices, and I'm going to pack it with a bunch of liberals who won't care about what the Constitution says. They'll just say everything I do is okay. They're going to allow all these left-wing socialist programs go ahead and get enacted. That was his solution. Fortunately, he wasn't able to pack the Supreme Court, but unfortunately, enough members died or left, and he was able to replace them with very liberal judges who ended up adopting his agenda. And what do we see today? The conservative court is still trying to enforce the Constitution, and the liberals are so upset. We have the head Democrat in the Senate, Charles Schumer, going to the Supreme Court and yelling, literally, at conservative justices, you better watch out. You better watch out. If you keep making these, quote, bad decisions, you won't know what hit you. What a threat he was making to the court members. And the Democrat Party today is very committed to increasing the number of Supreme Court justices so Biden can appoint several more liberals to outvote the conservatives that are on there. They want to preserve the Constitution. Yeah. So this is a long time issue. You know, some try to suggest the parties changed somewhere. They didn't change. Okay, the Democrats have been, since the initial, they didn't want to support the constitutional amendments, the 14th and 15th. They tried everything. They passed Jim Crow laws. They passed everything to stop it. Woodrow Wilson, actually Republican presidents integrated the civil service during the late 1800s. Wilson became president, the Democrat, and he resegregated it. He segregated the civil service again and was doing everything he can to support those who did not want black people to vote. Okay, when he finally left and we elected a Republican in 1920, Harding, he had his faults, he wasn't perfect. He went to Birmingham, Alabama to give a speech defending the right of all black people and all Americans to vote. Okay? That took courage, but he was forced to.
And he was a Republican.
Yes, he was a Republican, yes.
A lot of folks may or may not know that it was Roosevelt when they was trying to integrate the military and do certain things. He had a talk game, but folks know he wasn't going to do anything. Yeah. And when Truman came in, they say one thing about Roosevelt, he talked, but Truman, he might do something. And Truman actually done it. And I think that living, breathing document of the Constitution, I believe that was formulated, or that opinion came out during Woodrow Wilson's term in office. He looked at the Constitution as a living, breathing document that could be manipulated and amended without going through the constitutional message to amend.
Same for Franklin Roosevelt.
Yeah.
Truman largely was of the same viewpoint. He was trying to push all kinds of socialist proposals too. He did support integration of the armed forces, although the president who really implemented that was Eisenhower. Because he became president, he really pushed that, and he totally did it.
And you know, the person that stood in Eisenhower's way in the face of most of those things was Lyndon Johnson. It was the only one Lyndon Johnson became president. He was the stumbling block. Lyndon Johnson at that time, I think he was the majority leader
Yes,
in the
he was.
Senate.
He was.
And at that particular time, he was not the Lyndon Johnson that most people know now.
Yeah, that's right.
That's about when families started separating, and he enacted a lot of welfare
Democrats got
programs.
control of the Congress and been enacting aid to families with dependent children, which basically reward the family if the family broke up.
Yeah.
If the marriage broke up
Right.
and the man left, they would reward the family for that.
And that's the opposite of what conservatism is.
And that's what a lot of folks don't know about Johnson, is that we could have got a lot of those things up under Eisenhower, but if you do read your history and all, at that particular time, Lyndon Johnson, he was a Southern. He was anti.
He represented the Democrat Party. He was their
he
leader
was
in the
left.
Senate, just as Chuck Schumer is today. And it was the whole Democrat Party that was largely behind that.
Right.
And we saw again, 1957, what happened? We had 9 black students try to go to Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. Okay? What happened? Governor Oral Phoebus, a Democrat, sent 50 National Guard troops to Little Rock to keep those students out.
Sure did.
He said, I'm not going to allow any black students to go to this high school. And he used his power as governor to prevent black students from attending that high school. Had 50 National Guardsmen there. And then what happened? A Republican president, Dwight Eisenhower, sent 300 people from Fort Smith, who were part of the 101st Airborne Brigade, and he sent them to Little Rock. And they went there and they just told National Guard, we just ask you better step aside because we're here on the authority of the Commander-in-Chief of the United States, the President of the United States. We suggest you get out of our way because we're going to make sure these 9 students get into that school and they get in safely. That was a Republican president doing that. It was a Democrat governor that tried to keep these students out, and it was a Republican president that took strong action to get them in. And that was a symbol for the whole nation, that event. And that was done by a Republican president. It was not done by, and Eisenhower was far more conservative than some people give him credit for in many things. Okay, that was a very conservative action he took, and it was one that Republicans can be proud of today.
Yeah, you're so correct.
So I'd like to back up a little bit
Yes.
and talk more about limited government and why that is so important and why it's biblically important.
Yeah, that comes under the kind of the category of that since we are inherently imperfect or sinful, we've got to limit the power of people in charge of the government.
And in 1 Samuel...
1 Samuel chapter 8 is a great story. People in Israel were saying, wow, all these countries around us have kings. You know, they have all this power. And they can win wars and stuff like that. So they wanted a king. They said, we need a king. And God, through the prophet Samuel, told them, no, you do not want that. You do not want a highly centralized government. You don't want a dictator. You don't want a king. That is wrong. They will end up taking your sons and putting them to war. They'll take your property. We do not want that. But the people were foolish. Yes, we want that. Because we see in other countries, it looks like
They wanted an earthly king.
They want an earthly king, yes.
Instead of the Lord, our king.
Yes. And so they got it, and it did not work out well for them. Okay? And it never does.
Yeah, so that's kind of a lesson on limited government, why limited government is important. And it is good that we have these checks and balances. But elections are important also. We have to elect the right people.
Oh, yes.
To keep
if
this.
You don't elect people who believe in the Constitution and limited government,
who believe in the Lord,
separation of powers, and realize there's a fundamental moral underpinning of all of it, then you're going to have people who are going to take us down the wrong path. And that's what we're seeing. And it's sad, but we have one political party, the Democrat Party, that is geared to that. Okay, that's their whole modus operandi, their whole purpose now is to stop any moral influence and to put it into a purely secular humanist society and to stop the other. Yes.
One thing about the federal government this day and time under this particular administration, and this may be off a little bit as well, but under this administration, you look at the weaponization of the government, and the government was not meant, the judicial and all the other alphabet, EPA, which Department of Education, all these different offices has had, Department of Homeland Security, has been weaponized against individuals, conservatives, that they do not agree with. So much so that I was watching President Biden the other day, and I think he was visiting a community. It may have been a Latino community, but what he said, and a lot of people probably didn't pick up on this, but he said something about making a statement. He said, I could be elected president through acclamation. And that thing stuck with me. He actually said that a couple of days ago and I think that's what the party want now. They want their particular president to almost be elected through acclamation because they're putting so many stumbling blocks. If you go back, you be able to listen to one of his speeches just a couple of days. I don't think that was a Freudian slip. I think he kind of meant what he said.
We just witnessed that in Florida just a few days ago when we had our presidential primary. Republicans had a primary. Okay, anybody who wanted to run could run, and most of them ended up withdrawing, but they at least held the primary, giving Republican voters a chance to help nominate their candidate for president. The Democrats in Florida chose not to have a primary, not to allow the people to participate in that. The Florida Democrat Party said, we're just going to have all the delegates be for Biden, and that's it. We're not going to have a primary where people could come and perhaps vote against it.
Well, didn't the people want to vote? I mean, who's going to give up their right to vote?
Yes.
Escambia County did when we went to the superintendent. But aside from that, I mean, people want to vote.
Yeah. So precedent is something we do elect.
Yeah.
We need to have.
No society is going to give up their right to vote.
But they've given that up. They've chosen not to participate in Florida.
That is crazy.
Yeah.
That's wild.
So there's no opportunity.
So they're going to get a dictator,
Well,
but they're okay with something like that then.
Yeah. I mean, there was a simple example. They're constantly talking about democracy, and yet they're the very enemies of democracy. They're not going to allow their people to vote in Florida. They're trying to put the Republican nominee in jail for
Right.
nonsense. Okay,
Yeah.
things that
Just because they don't want him to be president again.
Yes,
That's the only reason.
They're trying to stop him from being on the ballot.
Yeah.
The Supreme Court had to step in. Even the 3 liberals on the court had to agree that is totally wrong. States cannot just arbitrarily decide, oh, we think you violated the 14th Amendment, so we're going to decide that you can't be on the ballot. Trump has not even been charged with insurrection by any federal prosecutor, much less convicted.
Well, they're going on
they're
lies.
trying to say that, we think you have, so we're going to. Colorado had a little 5-day trial where they didn't even allow Trump to come. Okay, and they decided he was guilty, so they decided we're going to keep him off the ballot.
And he's not even at his own trial.
The Supreme Court unanimously overturned that decision, and that's been settled now.
Well, so we're running out of time, but we do have a few minutes left.
Okay.
We could do a 5-hour show with you. We're going to have you back on next month. So I'd like to talk about economics and property rights and work ethic, but can we start with the noble woman? Like, what is a woman's job in society?
Okay. Well, first of all,
this is biblically
society
speaking.
doesn't tell a woman what she can and cannot do.
Exactly.
Okay. If a woman chooses to be a doctor, they can be a doctor. Okay. If they have the intelligence and the wherewithal and the intellectual capacity to get through medical school, they can be a doctor. Okay. You can't just hand it to anybody who put a Band-Aid on and say, I want to be a doctor. Okay. But it takes a lot. But they can be. So it's up to a woman to make those determinations. But when it comes to economics, the woman is given a very critical role, or we see a very good example in the 31st chapter of Proverbs, where it talks of several verses about a noble woman. Who is a noble woman? What are some of her characteristics? Well, one of the things that and this is Judeo-Christian based, is that we have to have property rights. Okay.
So women have property rights.
Yes.
Women can own property.
That's right. Men and women can own property. How do we know that? Well, we have 2 of the 10 commandments that focus on that. Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not even covet what somebody else has.
Right.
Okay, that's about as strong as you can get.
You should help them protect it
Being
and keep it.
compassionate to others on a voluntary basis is a positive
Not
thing.
try to take it away from them.
It's a very positive thing. But ultimately, we have to believe in property rights. You have a right to own property. You have a right to own property. Women, men, regardless of your gender, regardless of your race, you have a right to hold property. That was another thing Democrats tried to stop black people from doing, was owning property.
Right.
Okay. In any case, so there has to be these property rights there. We also have to have a work ethic. Okay. The Bible's very clear on that. There's numerous proverbs, Look at the ant, how he labors so hard and stores food in the summer and has stored it for his survival in the winter.
And during drought and famine.
The New Testament says, if he doesn't work, neither shall he eat. Okay? It's a very, very strong endorsement of the work ethic. It's a positive thing.
It's telling man, women, we have to work. We have jobs. We have vocations. And if we don't do it, our society is going to crumble.
In fact, God gave Adam work to do before the fall, before sin came into the world. He had to tend the garden. Okay, he was given a job to do. He had work to do.
Yeah.
So it's not just a punishment. It's a good for us.
Right.
Okay. What did the noble woman do? Well, she worked very hard. She had a strong work ethic. She saved money. Okay, it tells that she saved so she could buy property. She could make investments.
So she used the property to make money,
yes.
And she saved that money, and she used that money to buy more property.
To buy more property so she could expand what she was doing. Okay. Now she was generous. She was very hardworking. She used the free market that she had available to be able to do the things she wanted to do, to expand, to invest, to save. And then she was also a giving person, but it was voluntary on her part. It wasn't the government coming in taking their money and giving it to whoever they wanted to. It was good on her part. So she was able to do that. She was a good example of an enterprising person, a person who took advantage of the things God had given her. Being able to work, being able to save, being able to invest, being able to grow economically. She was a positive example. She was a noble woman for doing all that. So anybody who tries today to stop those types of behaviors, to try to stop somebody from working hard, to stop them from saving, to stop them from investing, expanding their business, if you will, that's totally wrong. It goes totally against the Judeo-Christian values that we believe in as conservatives. And we need to allow that. And people prosper. Okay? If you're against poverty, have more of that. Okay? When there was the least amount of government interference and there was stability in our government and our countries, those countries prosper. Okay, people grow, their economies grow, people understand I have to work, I have to do things, I have to save. If I really want to make more, I've got to be wise with the way I deal with money. And you will get rewards from that. The free market works. Socialism always fails. It never works, especially in the long run. Oh yeah, you might get, if you decide government starts to spend $1 billion, there's somebody getting some help out of that. Okay, right. It may not be people who need it. It may be somebody who's already rich getting more. Okay, but yeah, somebody's benefiting from that. But that's not right. That's not the way we should have things. We should have a free market, as free as possible, so people can be rewarded if they behave like the noble woman in Proverbs 31. So that's what's going to produce a fair society, a reasonable society, a just society, and a more prosperous society, and reduce poverty.
And I think men and women both working in partnership. Just working in partnership, mutual respect. And I grew up in Holiness/Protestant church, and my church would always go to the book of Ephesians, and there are some things within that particular book that refers to men and women not to be taken out of context and maybe not to even be taken verbatim, but there's a lot of mutual respect within that particular book.
Well, they each have a job. Yeah. Women have a job, and it's more than just being the noble woman and more than just owning property and everything that goes with that. But she also has the job as a wife. And then men have a job. So you can look at the two different categories. So you mentioned if a man doesn't work, neither shall he eat. Yes. So men have a vocation and a job, biblically and conservatively, to expand on that. So can we just briefly talk about what the man's role is? So the woman has the noble role, but what is man's role?
Well, I think it's the same. As far as producing, he needs to work, he needs to save, he needs to invest, he needs to help
and
grow,
take care of his family,
and so doing,
and be
he's
generous,
going to be more able to take care of his family and perhaps take care of neighbors as well. He can help more if he does follow those basic patterns that we're talking about.
Yeah.
He can expand his business or his prosperity so that he can help others. So he has that role. Obviously, he has the, a woman is more likely to be the one who takes care of young children. Okay, but that doesn't have to be. Fathers can help out in that area too. So it's not like we're dictating roles there, but there are roles that both can do to expand their prosperity. Yes.
It was great to have you on the show.
Okay.
We are out of time. Like I said, we could go for 5 hours. We'll have to have you back on.
Okay.
So the Thornton Review is on the air to provide public service awareness and intellectual infrastructure to our community. You can watch our program on our newest outlet, Pensacola Urban Network Praise TV on WBQP 12.1 and 12.8. And you can watch us on Praise TV on Roku Television Network, or download Praise TV on Google Play Store and on thethorntonreview.com. Our website is thethorntonreview.com. This show is made possible by Ida Gates Godly Tees LLC, Next Door Real Estate Photography, First National Title Insurance Company, and our guest, retired Lieutenant Commander John Roberts, current chairman of the Escambia County Republican Party. We thank you for watching this episode of the Thornton Review. Bye-bye.